Hey everybody, Professor Dust here, and now we have path goal theory. This is our second to last classical approach of leadership that we'll cover before getting into contemporary approaches. One of the more important slides, I think it's a nice little snapshot of what exactly the path goal theory is articulating. It's essentially saying, look, there's two different things you can look into, similar to what we just talked about with the situational approach, is follower characteristics. And then the second thing is task characteristics. So path goal is kind of an extension of situational theory, and then it's saying, hey, don't just look at the followers' readiness and commitment, or competence and commitment. We also need to understand the type of tasks that they're engaging in. Right, so very similar, but it's just kind of taking it a step further and saying, hey, there's another layer of things that we're not really considering. And so, using the contingency approach to leadership, well, what's the best way to engage in leadership? Well, it's two things. It's the follower as context, and it's also the task at hand as context. And so it essentially says, hey, if you have these characteristics of the follower, these characteristics of the task, then you should consider directive. Same thing for supportive, participative, achievement-oriented. Right? So directive, it's providing that guidance. Supportive, you're just being more relationship-oriented. Participative, you're involving them, but at the same time, you are really still kind of in charge of the final decision. And then achievement oriented, you're really giving them challenges so they can learn and grow. Okay, so this is a little bit more linear than I think is probably necessary, and it's kind of saying directive's good and achievement oriented is bad. At least that kind of has the connotation here in some of the writing of path goal theory, where if you have to direct, that's kind of you're probably going to get just simple results. You do this, okay, I'll do that, and we all go home. It's very transactional. Where achievement-oriented is kind of the ideal, where eventually you get them to the point where you're giving them challenges that could potentially allow them to take over your role whenever you move up to the next stage, whatever that might be. Some of the strengths of this framework, it is helpful in that it understands some outcome variables that haven't been really talked about in detail before. Right, so talking about the conceptual model is what we called it earlier, but the theoretical model, you could also call it that, where you're looking at a variety of different variables in terms of the antecedents, consequences, or independent variable, meeting variable, dependent variable, whatever you want to call those terms. This was starting to finally look at satisfaction of followers as a dependent variable, as well as the followers' work performance. Right? So it's not just about the leader's performance. Did they emerge and were they considered effective by the followers? What really matters is, did we get objective outcomes from the followers? Right? So that's another advancement that was important in these models. Another important advancement is that it was starting to integrate motivation. It's almost impossible to talk about leader-follower relationships without understanding some degree of motivation. And so they drew upon expectancy theory as part of their overarching theory for path goal theory, which was helpful. And it's also pretty practical. It really talks about what can we do to help our followers, and I would say situational is relatively practical as well, and those two are moving closer to that direction of saying, here's the prescriptive suggestions for what you need to do. Some of the criticisms, however, it's confusing. I mean, can you imagine, having to, on the fly, be able to say, okay, does it have follower characteristic X, Y, or Z? At what level is it? Does it have task characteristic X, Y, or Z? What level is it? Okay, because of that, now I got to decide I'm going to do this. It's just too much. And so it's just, to some degree, it gets back to that same conversation I had earlier about specificity and accuracy versus broad and applicable. It was becoming more and more accurate because it was being more and more specific about the context at hand, but it was also becoming less and less practical to actually implement in any one type of setting. And so there has been some empirical research that's demonstrated that some of the conceptual models and some of the ideas here are accurate. So that's promising, but again, I think that's partly because it's more specific and it's more accurate. But that doesn't mean the entire picture was accurate. It means like different slivers within some of the ideas presented were supported. It doesn't explain, though, some other relationships that it calls upon in this model, such as leader behavior and worker motivation. It just kind of implies that motivation is part of it, but it doesn't really explain what exactly the leader's doing to motivate their followers. And I'd say with contemporary theories of leadership, they do a much better job of this. You'll really see this when we start talking about transformational leadership. It's almost built more so from a motivation standpoint than it is from a leadership standpoint. And then finally, path goal theory treats leadership as a one-way event in which the leader affects the follower. And this is kind of setting us up for the next material, leader-member exchange, where it is going beyond just what's going on in the leader's brain and starts to say, hey, this is an interactive reciprocal relationship. And so we'll talk about that next. To wrap up for some of the path goal theory material, one of the most important elements is a broadened motivation theory, in particular the expectancy theory, which just says, hey, if I work harder, effort, is it really going to lead to some change in performance? And then if I do have a change in performance, higher performance, am I going to get rewarded for it, and do I care about it? Right? So if I spend 10 extra hours a week answering student questions in email through additional office hour chats, is that going to lead to higher evaluation ratings from students? And if I do get higher evaluation ratings from students, is that going to lead to promotion, pay, whatever it might be? And then balance being, do I care about that? Do I care about promotions or care about pay? Right? So you really can't motivate anybody until you have all of those pieces of the puzzle. That is expectancy theory. And then another big important part of understanding these leadership concepts is, again, this descriptive versus prescriptive. Path goal and situational really start to get more prescriptive, meaning they're prescribing for you what to do. They're giving you some advice. They're saying, here's a framework. Look at this framework, and if X, Y, and Z happen, then do this. Where formerly it was way more descriptive. It was just saying, hey, what are the traits of leaders? What are the skills of leaders? But it didn't really kind of take it to that so what question. Okay, so that wraps up path goal theory.